to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Season 7 of Raising Teens. I'm Collett Smart and I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and your host on Raising Teens. I'm also a parent and I'm in the middle of raising my own teens and young adult children. I know that raising teens can be fun and crazy and exciting, but also terrifying and even lonely. I've experienced all of these emotions, sometimes in the same day. On this podcast, I'm joined by well-known experts, and we will chat about some of the most common questions that I get asked about raising teenagers in my own work, and even some questions I have myself. I've loved seeing all your questions come in, so this season I'm going to focus on some that teachers, parents, and carers have raised. We're all caring for the teens we love so much, so please send in your ideas and your questions through my Instagram and Facebook page or via the Hope Podcast webpage so we can support this generation of teens together. Today we welcome Lucy Thomas back for part 2 of the mini-series on bullying. Lucy is the co-founder of Project Rockit. As a keynote speaker and facilitator with a blended academic background in psychology and creative arts, Lucy has personally worked with hundreds of thousands of young people all over the world. In this episode, Lucy and I chat about being a bystander because in bullying incidents, the majority of teens fit into this group. So a bystander is the person who is present at an event or incident but does not take part in the bullying. I actually teach undergrad students about something called the bystander effect. So what is the meaning of the bystander effect? Really, this is if you witnessed an emergency happening right in front of your eyes, you would certainly take some sort of action to help the person in trouble. Well, while we might all like to believe that this is true, research tells us that whether or not you intervene might depend upon the number of other witnesses present. The bystander effect, sometimes called bystander apathy, refers to the phenomenon in which the greater the number of people there are present, the less likely individuals are to help a person in distress. In other words, being part of a large crowd makes it so that no single person feels like they are responsible for getting involved. There are two major factors that contribute to this bystander effect. The first is the number of people around, and the second one is a fear of making a scene yourself. And it becomes even more difficult to intervene and easier to justify your apathy when a situation is ambiguous. Your teen might wonder if they are actually reading the situation correctly. If you're the only person seeing bullying, it is easier to think it's 100% my responsibility to do something. But if there are 10 people around, it's easier to think it's 90% other people's responsibility to do something. So the more people around the incident, your share in the responsibility becomes less and less. Adults might see this in other areas like voting, where people think, oh, what difference does my one vote make? Hello, Lucy. Welcome back to Raising Teens.
Thanks. It's great to be back for a two-parter.
Yeah, you are my first guest doing a 2-part series, and it's because the topic of bullying is enormous, and I felt like we couldn't cover bullying all in the one episode. So today, that's what we're going to dive into a little bit more. What is the role of the bystander? You know, in university, I teach the bystander effect, but it's so hard for our young people to speak up. They know they should, and we encourage them to, but it's not as simple as just speak up. How do you, or what do you do when you encourage young people in schools? What do you encourage them to say, or how to interact to keep themselves safe in some ways? There's a great fear in young people that the bullying or the bully is going to turn on them somehow, and then they're going to stand out and they're going to end up being the target.
We really need to acknowledge that as a genuine risk as well. You know, Yeah, look, we know that the long-term negative impacts of bullying are pervasively negative, both for those who bully and for those who are bullied. And when I hear that 1 in 4 young Aussies report being bullied each week, I see this as a call to action to empower the remaining 3 in 4 to actually do something about it. Bullying happens largely when there's an audience, whether that be physically or online. And that audience has a decision to make as to what we endorse, what we condone, what we accept, what we tolerate. And yet at the same time, it comes with a huge personal risk to differentiate yourself from that audience, to step up and out and to challenge behaviour that isn't okay. And so there are a range of ways that we can do that. We need to acknowledge that for students who have experienced marginalisation or bullying themselves, there will be additional kind of challenges. For students of different cultures and physicalities and different abilities and with neurodiversity or different gender and sexuality identities, there are going to be additional kind of factors to consider as well in putting themselves out in front of the peer group. So it's important that we take an individualized approach, that we prepare students rather than saying just stand up in the moment. We look at what it might look like to intervene, preparing students with what they might say ahead of time or how they might keep themselves safe, whether that be standing up as a group rather than on your own, or seeking an ally from someone who might have a little bit more social power than you. These are the kinds of conversations we can have once we actually cut through, rather than having an overly simplified conversation with young people. We talk about some of the nuance in these situations, and it's quite incredible. I was saying before, having worked with now 600,000 young people, we probably hear some themes around the common risks and fears that young people experience, but there's still so much individuality involved in standing up for what you believe in. And so it's really important that we first understand, the kind of context so that we're able to come up with solutions for bystanders to intervene, and that we focus on developing their own self-awareness and emotional literacy so that they're able to accurately read a situation and look out for themselves as well as looking out for others.
Fantastic. What does it look like to help young people to be a bystander online? What is the right term I'm looking for? Because a bystander almost means like you stand by and do nothing.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah. So what do you talk about with young people?
Yeah, I think, one of the terms that is popularly thrown around is around digital citizenship. So what does it mean to be a positive digital citizen? That said, with Project Rockit, we asked a group of year 7s, what's a digital citizen? And they thought it was an avatar or a gaming character. So I don't know that there actually is the right word. But for us, it's really the number one hero action that we can take is about cultivating empathy. When we're removed from a situation, when we're behind a screen, it's easy to not consider or be faced with the reality of our actions and how they impact those around us. And so sometimes we need some help to connect our behaviour to the impact, the emotional impacts. All of us can play a role in cultivating empathy online, whether that be with our young people, whether that be in our classrooms, whether that be as peers. Oh, how do you think that would have felt when you made that comment to that person? It can also be about extending an expression of empathy to somebody. So, to take someone who's seen bullying happen online and encourage them towards action, they might be too afraid to make a public comment saying they disagree, but they can send a private message to the person targeted saying, hey, I really feel for you. That must have really hurt and I disagree with what's happening. So yeah, that it's absolutely about cultivating empathy, but also balancing some of those really tangible actions we can take. As I said, sending a direct message, reporting the bullying to the platform, helping the person targeted to come forward to the school and encouraging them, being the person beside them, and also screenshotting evidence if that might be needed later. So there's a range of pro-social behaviours we can encourage young people towards when they're seeing these behaviours.
You might be thinking, how can I help my teen to overcome this bystander effect? Well, research suggests that simply being aware of this tendency is perhaps the greatest way to break the cycle. So we can start by making our teens aware of it. But the question you might be asking is, how do I help my kids take the step from bystander to upstander? Because we know that if peers intervene, over 50% of bullying episodes will stop. In part 1 of this mini-series on bullying, we spoke about the 4 tactics of bullying. So it would be good to start by brainstorming with your teen what might be effective in different situations. For example, in covert and direct bullying, you might suggest show your disapproval, like frowning at a mean joke or shaking your head to show you don't think that something is right. You could also suggest your teen interrupt the bullying by talking to the person being bullied. For example, "Hey Ravi, there you are, I was looking for you." Or give the person being bullied an excuse to leave the situation. They might say, "Oh, the sport teacher's looking for you," or "Can you come and help me with something for a minute?" Across all 4 bullying tactics, it is effective to let the person being bullied know that you saw the bullying and you don't agree with it. Your teen could also offer support in private, or once they feel safe from the situation, they might say something like, "I saw what was happening at lunchtime. It's not okay for them to act that way." Or, "Are you okay? How can I help you?" We would also suggest to our teens to report it to a trustworthy adult, such as a teacher, a parent, or even kids' helpline. If possible, they might ask their friend if they want to report it together, because being bullied can be really lonely, and having a friend through a tough time can make a big difference to someone being bullied. Often young people who feel marginalized or alone online, one of the most powerful things we can do for them is ensure that they have, or they recognize, it doesn't have to be a community. It can just be one other person that might be their support. And it's interesting you mentioned that because for young people who are bullied, it's the aloneness or feeling so isolated that is incredibly damaging. And so finding ways that we can ensure that they have people they can connect in with, I think is really important. What do we do if a young person begs us not to say or do anything, and yet we still see them in a bad place, in danger?
Yeah, great question. I think a really difficult one. We actually find at Project Rockit, we're asked this question by young people a lot as well. Like, What if my friend tells me how badly they're being bullied and I can see they're not okay, but they beg me not to tell? What do I do in these situations? And we call these kind of unsafe secrets among young people.
Yeah.
But the first thing to remember is that as I said before, by confiding in you, they are doing something. They're choosing not to hold the problem on their own, and that's incredibly powerful. It's powerful that they've taken this issue away from their online community and they've actually daylighted it, that they've taken it into the real world. And from here, you can work with them towards approaching the school or taking some kind of other action. But it's important to understand, I think in the first instance, why is it that they don't want you to say anything? Is it genuinely just an irrational fear that doing so is going to make things worse? Are they worried that they'll get into trouble? Because have they actually played a role in perpetrating some kind of harm? Or do they maybe have a better insight into the way that the school handles these things and they're not confident? These are all important details that will help the way that you work with them to actually feel empowered to talk to their teacher to come forward.
We need to, of course, understand that our teens won't tell us everything, as much as we wish they would, especially if a friend made them promise not to tell. This is a common issue and something I hear often. We can preempt this by having discussions about friends asking them to keep unsafe secrets. Let them know that you are on their side and that you are there to offer support and empower them, and you won't freak out. Even if they can't tell you everything, they can keep their friend anonymous and get support for themselves, perhaps by finding their own counselor or calling Kids Helpline. Anything is a good start. And then gently remind your child that they are not a trained counselor, but the support they can give is being the best friend they can be. And often the best thing they can do is make sure that their friend gets the support they need. So when you go into a school and you talk about the bystander and you're talking to a hall full of young people, how do you make that individual? I'm just curious what that might look like
Yeah, great question. When we started out, I mentioned that we started out as a little anti-bullying project. When I was growing up, I'd had a lot of school-based programs that had come to my school. We'd had inspirational talks from people who'd been bullied and kind of survived. We'd had law enforcement talk to us about the legal impacts, and we'd also had the terrifying lecture from the principal just telling us not to do it. But what was kind of missing was anything that put the conversation back in our hands as students. And so what Project Rockit really strives to do, rather than going into a school and telling all of the answers or telling all of the strategies, is to facilitate conversations with the peer group that actually allow the student cohort to name the risks. We do a lot of drama, role plays, interactive facilitated group discussions so that we can safely, without talking about referencing specific situations that might be happening in the school, so that we can name those risks, name those challenges, and then start to collaboratively brainstorm strategies that we would be actually comfortable to use. So it's a much more kind of crowdsourced approach to learning than that traditional, speaking from the front of the classroom. And we really aim to harness the energy of the group and the lived experience of the student body.
Talk to me also a little bit. You said something about bullies and victims and not using those labels. I love that idea. Can you talk that through a little bit more?
Absolutely. I think this was very intuitive for us starting out as young people, and I think actually this emerging generation is rejecting labels more than any before, understanding that labels can be oppressive and they prevent behavioural change rather than enabling it. But for us, on two sides of a continuum, there's a bully and there's the victim. And there's a really wide body of evidence that indicates similarly negative long-term outcomes for both, sadly linked to, incarceration, episodes of family violence, poorer mental and physical health, disengagement from the workforce, and the list goes on. And so we know that actually, creating these labels entrenches the behaviours that go with whatever it means to be a bully or to be a victim. And instead, for us, it was really important that it also, the other thing I'll name is it just shuts down the audience. When you talk about the bully and the victim, nobody wants to be that character. Nobody wants to be.
Yes. No one wants to be the bully, but also nobody wants to be the victim.
Exactly.
Because they also feel embarrassed and weak and so on.
And I've walked into, settings before working with young people where an adult may have said before we're just about to start the workshop, oh, watch out for this kid. He's definitely the bully. Oh. And I think, what a shame that, I try and shed that judgment as soon as I've heard it, because it's so often that we find those are the exact students that respond so well to Project Rockit. They've never been given necessarily an avenue that reached them to access a different pathway, to choose to, all of that power that they hold in the group, that they can actually use that for good, that they can actually be a beacon of activity and action and leadership for their peers rather than the bully. And so it's about cultivating new ways of being. So for us, bullying is a behaviour. It's not a label. It's not an identity. It's a behaviour that all of us are capable of perpetuating, but also all of us are capable of challenging. And in every moment, we have a choice to make. Am I going to be part of the problem or part of the solution?
In terms of any of these, encourage your teen to talk with their group of friends one at a time about being like-minded against bullying, because a lot of upstanding behaviours become easier when it is a group standing together. You might give them an idea like saying, I felt really uncomfortable when I saw that happen to Sally. What do you think? Doing this soon after the incident can often be more effective than waiting too long. Doing this gives your child a place to start with what to try next. Because what if their friend says, no, I think Sally deserved it? You would talk with your teen about the fact that just because other people are ignoring something doesn't mean it should be ignored. The hard thing to say at this point is that sometimes being an upstander doesn't work out perfectly in the end. Doing the right thing doesn't always work out like the movies. So why do we bother? We bother because, as Lucy says, we want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and that is part of developing good character. These kinds of actions define who we are, and we want to help our kids build themselves into the person they are proud of. I've seen, and even in personal experience, I've seen young people speak up and then the bully turns on them as they feared, or sometimes the school has not handled it really well and, the behavior or the bullying continues weeks afterwards. And so now getting the young person to speak up and ask for help is even more difficult. What do you advise schools to do in situations like that? I mean, schools do a lot of things right, but what are schools doing wrong that they could do differently when a young person speaks up and it actually escalates into something worse for the young person?
Yeah, I think on the whole, the biggest constraint for schools is resourcing and the sheer volume of responsibilities that they need to perform to take care of their student cohort. That, 50 years ago, the teacher taught the student the 3 R's. And these days, you teach your student technology, you teach them, you take care of their well-being, you also have to tell them to tuck in their school shirt, you're teaching them how to be workplace ready, there's such a huge raft of responsibilities that fall on a teacher's plate. And I'd say that I have a huge amount of respect and regard for the volume of, just the labour and that kind of deep care that teachers carry. I also think, though, and I have seen times when schools are dismissive of the internal biases that, all of us carry. And so, students are very articulate about the ways that they've seen their teachers ignore or tolerate or overlook slurs used in the classroom. And an example of that is there's research looking at the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in the classroom who actually attributed much of the racism that they encountered to the tolerance of teachers, who allowed this to happen. And so it's really important that, when students see these behaviours, they identify that you're not somebody who's going to have their back when they're being bullied. I'd also just say, though, that on the whole, it's really hard to be the uniform disciplinarian and the person who's taking care of someone's well-being. It's really hard to be holding the needs of the parent and the needs of the student, to be making sure that what you're teaching is culturally safe and curriculum aligned. And so that's where organisations like Project Rockit, we're here to help. One of the things that teachers routinely tell us, it's just this relief. My gosh, hearing this, for our students to hear this from someone who's closer to their age group, who actually, is living and breathing technology and doesn't have to hold the responsibility for their behaviour and their grades and their overall conduct, is just such a relief to have this support. And so, I just wanted to name that there is a lot of support out there for schools to you don't have to do this on your own, and there is a lot of support, not just Project Rockit, but other organisations as well.
Fantastic. And so some of your programs that you do where the young people brainstorm and do all sorts of things to come up with what would work for them. Do you have sometimes teachers involved in that?
Yeah, great question. Starting out, full disclosure is that I used to be a bit scared still as a young person of teachers, and in particular of principals. I used to become really nervous when we were trying to, initiate relationships with schools, and I'd be invited to the principal's office, even though I was there for a business meeting. And I'd say that, in the history of Project Rockit, this hasn't been one of our strengths. I always felt really that I was in my element connecting with and engaging school students, but it's taken us a long time to develop the experience, the maturity, and the confidence as an organisation to meaningfully support teachers. But a big change for us is actually, we've always supported a whole school approach, previously partnered and worked in great collaboration with other organisations supporting teachers. But now we do think it's really important that, teachers are informing, shaping our programs, and that we're playing a role of a bit of an intermediary between students and teachers to connect them. And so, we do have a new digital offering. It's called Project Rockit Digital, original name, but there you go. It does what it says on
Brilliant.
the tin. And actually, this is about connecting teachers with youth-created resources, video storytelling, teaching resources they can use, as well as a whole teacher community of practice that's nationwide, facilitated by Project Rockit, so that we can be sparking these meaningful conversations led by teachers across Australia.
Bullying is caused by dysfunctional systems, whether it's work or school or other institutions. It is further affected by individual personalities, so intervention and even treatment types may be complex. But the common question I often get is, what if my child says do nothing? Either way, start by giving them a voice rather than telling them what you think should happen next. For example, ask them what their goal is. Do they want to play in a supportive team? Do they want people around them that they feel comfortable with? Would they like some sort of justice? And then what are the steps to meet that goal? Would they like to try a different sporting team? Do they want to make a healthier friend group? Or would they like to see a counselor for support? Then when approaching the school, I think it's important to ask what the school's response or policy is to bullying. In other words, how they look after the bystander or the victim regardless of who reports the incident. Unless there is a crime being committed or risk of serious harm, you can take some time if you need to before giving the school all the details. Make a decision about what to do next with your child involved. I have personal experience as a mum when I didn't do this very well and I should have involved my child in some of the decisions more. But if the school is not assisting your child in the way that you're happy with and they need more support than what you can provide at home, please consult your family doctor and request someone who helps teens deal with bullying. This will give your teens skills in dealing with bullies into their adult years. Remember that treatment can be quick and it can take even 4 to 6 sessions on average to give your child support. Also, avoid any therapist who tells your child just walk away. Remember I said there is no evidence that this works.
And that's, you're really speaking into what we're seeing in education now. There's a lot more of what we're calling the flipped classroom, even in unis and in schools. It is more empowering rather than, the old, we call it the chalk and talk, where the person stands in the front and seems to have all the knowledge and the children are falling asleep in their seats kind of thing, because it's not really relevant to where they're at. This whole approach you have is really empowering, and there's a lot of evidence behind it that when we actually put some of those opportunities into the hands of young people and letting them role play or talk it out or talk about solutions that are actually relevant to them and their peer group, we're actually seeing changes. And I know a lot of your work is evidence-based. Talk to me about what that looks like and how you came to an evidence-based program.
Definitely starting out, this was an area as two young people fresh out of school that we weren't super confident about, and understood that our expertise was our lived experience, but that has a hard limit. So we went away and we piloted our programs and aligned them with existing research. And it's taken a long time to build our own evidence base, but we're kind of getting there. But, rewinding for a moment, for us that was looking at what does effective bystander intervention look like? What does it look like to flip traditional pedagogy and hear from all students in the classroom? How do narratives that label young people as the bully and the victim actually become entrenched into adulthood? So, I mentioned that long-term negative trajectory for young people who are bullied and those who bully. For us, that was really important that we don't label young people as the bully and the victim if we know that that's going to lead to that negative outcome. And so we started building together a methodology that was based around youth participation. Almost each workshop is built through a methodology of co-design with young people. We're co-designing strategies, but also that kind of best practice around what's actually going to empower a young person to successfully intervene in the moment.
And so can you give me some examples? What do young people come up with? What do they say is empowering for them to successfully intervene?
So often the power of a group is a really important lever that young people don't necessarily realise they can pull. Often when there's an immobile, passive watching audience, you can tend to infer that everyone thinks what's happening is okay, and everyone is going along with this behaviour, therefore I must be the only person who cares. Actually, what happens in a Project Rockit workshop is we start to unlock various opinions around the room that surface a new norm, that it's not okay to bully, that it's not cool to hate on somebody because they're different. And actually what that does is carrying that into the next interaction where you see somebody being put down for who they are. It sets a new norm where you know that your peers don't agree with bullying behaviour. You know that if you speak up, you'll have more support. So in a way, it's almost destigmatizing this idea that to stand up is to somehow make yourself a target. And it's actually providing an alternative accountability for those who who see bullying happen. But we come up with a whole range of strategies. Sometimes it might be changing your body language. And if 50 people in the room change the way they look on at a bullying situation, even just not laughing, not pulling out your phone to film what's happening, not going along with it and actually choosing to give it no airtime. Some of these behaviours can actually be really effective behavioural strategies. And so it's about harnessing those and using them collectively and deliberately.
Fantastic. And so what is your hope for young people in this line of work that you do then, Lucy?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. I think we tend to focus our conversations around young people and technology into the negative. You know, we worry about the online harms and risks and everything that can go wrong. But equally, I see in my day-to-day young people who are reclaiming technology as a vehicle for kindness and connection, that this generation, more than any other before, has access to an abundance of global perspectives. They have much more diverse role models than the role models I had on television growing up. And social media can really play that role in disrupting traditional power structures. They are able to continue and accelerate their embracing of technology as a vehicle for kindness, as a vehicle for connection and inclusion and making the world a better place. You know, back when I was in school, it definitely, part of the reason we started Project Rockit was that it sort of felt that the students' role in school culture was to be the passive recipient of the culture set for them by teachers and school staff and schools' values, and your parents and the parent council. But actually the role that I see and the hope that I have for young people is that they're elevated with the tools and the support to actually lead thriving and inclusive student cultures. I think that's where we'll really see a shift around these behaviours, when students are actually elevated to a position of leadership on the issues that impact them the most.
My goodness, this was a big topic. It was great to have Lucy for this mini-series. You can find their work at projectrockit.com.au. That's Project Rockit, spelled ROCKIT.com.au. I know that raising teens can bring up questions big and small, and I'm so thankful for the questions that keep coming in. So this season, I've decided I'm going to be doing some more Q&As. If you have any specific question about bullying or topics from other episodes or any other topics that you want to learn more about, please send them to raisingteens.au.
You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.